timing, in a very important way, was perfect because of the Ukraine war, which is a foolish war that's we, the United States, have a great interest in ending the war in Ukraine so that we can concentrate. Deterring China today, it would be better if Japan had nuclear weapons. But, this is the all-important word, but the United States want to be the country that determines when nuclear weapons are used or not used.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this program. I am a public policy consultant, Kenichi Murofushi. Today, we welcome Professor John Miyashima from Chicago University. Welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Very nice to meet you.
Likewise. Glad to be here.
Thank you very much. I suppose that not so many Japanese people know about Professor Miyashima. He is quite sophisticated and quite influential international political scientist. Today, I want to discuss about great transformation of international order and Japanese policy. First of all, I introduce Professor Miyashima. You are really realist political science, am I correct?
Correct. I am a realist to the core. I think there are few academics or few scholars who are as pure a realist as I am.
Even in Japan, but in case of the United States, it is true. Here, there's no so much realist.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think in the United States, in academia, and in the policy world at large, there are not a lot of people who self-identify as realists. The United States is a thoroughly liberal country.
Yeah, I know.
And most liberals are very uncomfortable with realism. So in the academic world in the United States, most scholars of international politics are liberals. And of course, the same thing is true here in Japan.
Yes.
Japanese academia is filled with IR scholars who are card-carrying liberals and are not realists. So there's no doubt about that.
Thank you both. Even though there is very long history of realistic policy, realist international political science in the United States, for example, Hans Morgenthau or John Hart, why so many liberals in the United States?
Well, again, I think it has to do with the sort of the ideological makeup of the United States. Mm-hmm. The United States is a thoroughly liberal country. And liberals tend to be idealistic. They tend to think that you can make the world a better place. And realism is a theory that is pessimistic at its core. Realism's understanding of international politics basically says that states have no choice but to compete with each other for power.
Yep.
States are primarily concerned with the balance of power, and they want to take advantage of each other. It's a deeply pessimistic worldview, and that runs against, it's contrary to the American, to the optimism that has long dominated American thinking about how to deal with the world around us. So realism and liberalism, right, are in a very important way at loggerheads, and the liberalism dominates the realism. So you're right that people like Morgenthau and Hers have mattered in the United States and have mattered in academia. But they have not mattered that much because, again, the United States is a thoroughly liberal country.
Oh, what's a pity. But in case of U.S. foreign policy, they practices very realistic policy, I suppose.
Well, my argument is that except for the unipolar movement, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Except for the unipolar moment, the United States behaves like a realist country and talks like a liberal country.
Yeah.
In other words, during the Cold War, the United States behaved in a very realist fashion toward the Soviet Union, which is to say the United States pursued ruthless policies towards the Soviet Union. We were interested during the Cold War in wrecking the Soviet Union. And we were ruthless. We behaved in a very realist way, but we talked in an idealistic way. We talked in a very liberal way. And the same thing is happening today with regard to China. The United States is bent on containing China. The United States wants to prevent China from catching up to the United States. But we talk like liberals. We're the good guys, the Chinese are the bad guys. You know, it's just typical liberal rhetoric. But we behave like realists. The one exception to this is during the unipolar moment.
Yeah.
This is the period that runs from 1992 to 2017.
After the collapse of the USSR.
Pardon?
After collapse of USSR.
Yes, after the collapse of the USSR. The Soviet Union collapses in December of 1991. So I would date the unipolar moment from 1992, to roughly 2017. And remember, what happens in roughly 2017 is that China and Russia become great powers. So we move into a multipolar world. I grew up in a bipolar world during the Cold War. Then we moved into unipolarity, and now we're in multipolarity. Now, my argument is that the United States behaves like a realist country and talks like a liberal country in bipolarity and multipolarity. But in unipolarity, the United States actually pursued a liberal foreign policy because there were no other great powers in the system. The United States didn't have to engage in security competition with another great power because there was no great power. So what we did was we pursued this foreign policy of liberal hegemony. In other words, we talked like a liberal state and we acted like a liberal state. And my argument is we got ourselves into a heck of a lot of trouble during the unipolar moment pursuing a liberal foreign policy.
Is it applicable to after Donald Trump administration? I think his way of behave is quite realistic.
Well, here's
and
my
his
argument.
policies also, the way of speaking is also realistic, I suppose.
Well, I'll make a couple points.
Yes.
First of all, Donald Trump speaks one way one day and a different way the next day. It's not easy to determine exactly what Donald Trump's worldview is. So I'm very reluctant to call him a realist. There's no question that some days he talks like a realist. Other days he doesn't talk like a realist. But my more important point is that no matter who is in charge in the United States, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, and no matter who is in charge in Japan today, the leaders in those countries have no choice but to act like realists, because we are no longer in a unipolar world. We are in a multipolar world where states have to act according to balance of power calculations. You take a country like Japan. No matter who is in charge in Japan, no matter who the prime minister is, he or she has to work to contain China. He or she has to work with the United States to put together a containment strategy against China. The structure of the system leaves the Japanese prime minister and the American president with no choice. That's the way the world works. So I think there's no question that President Trump acted like a realist in very important ways after he came to power the first time. And you want to remember, I said to you that I thought the unipolar moment ended in 2017. That China and Russia were then powerful enough to qualify as great powers. So we went from unipolarity to multipolarity in 2017, okay? When did Donald Trump enter the White House for the first time? In January 2017.
Yeah.
So Trump became president just as we transitioned from unipolarity to multipolarity. And what that tells you is that given that change in the structure of the system, of course we would expect the United States under Donald Trump to act in a more realist fashion than had been the case when Barack Obama was president, or when George W. Bush was president, or when Bill Clinton was president, because they were all presidents during the unipolar moment. So Trump's timing, in a very important way, was perfect. He became president as we moved into multipolarity. And again, my argument is, whether it was Donald Trump or Joe Biden, he had no choice but to act in a realist fashion, because containing China for the United States and for Japan is so important.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned now as multipolar world. How many polars? United States, China, Russia, Europe?
No, Europe is not a country.
No.
Europe is not a country.
Area, NATO.
It's just an area.
Okay.
There are only 3 countries in the world that are great powers: the United States, China, and Russia. The United States is by far the most powerful state on the planet. The Chinese are number 2, and they're catching up to the United States. That's why we refer to China as a peer competitor. And Russia is the 3rd great power. It's the weakest of the 3 great powers.
Sometimes some scholars mentioned the power of India. What do you think about this?
I think that if there is a country on the planet that might become a great power in the future, so that we would have 4 great powers, that country is India. But at this point in time, the Indians do not have the economic power to produce the necessary military capability to qualify as a great power. The 2 principal indicators of latent power are population size and wealth. China was not considered a great power during the Cold War. Just think about it. During the Cold War, we said there were 2 great powers on the planet, the United States and the Soviet Union. Why wasn't China a great power? It definitely had the population size. It did not have the sufficient wealth. It did not have sufficient wealth to produce the military might to qualify as a great power.
That's a source of power.
Yes, the 2 principal sources of power. Population size and wealth. And China today has the population size and the wealth. That's why it's a peer competitor of the United States. Lots of Chinese people, lots of wealth. The United States, lots of Americans, lots of wealth. Go back to the Cold War. China, lots of people, not a lot of wealth. So that's the key. But to go to your question about India today, lots of people. It's the most populous country in the world. Lots of people, but not a lot of wealth. And by the way, the same is true of Indonesia. Indonesia has the 4th largest population in the world. If Indonesia gets wealthy, if it has a robust per capita GNP, Indonesia will be a great power.
I see. From Japanese point of view, Indonesia is still developing country compared to Japan. So
what is still a developing?
Developing country, not advanced country.
Which is a developing country?
Indonesia.
Oh, definitely, definitely. No, it's a developing country. That's what I'm saying. And China was considered a developing country from an economic point of view. You remember when China was admitted to the World Trade Organization in 2001, it was treated as a developing country, right? And it was a developing country, but in 2025, China is not a developing country anymore.
Country,
It's an impressive economic powerhouse. And of course, that's why it is a peer competitor with the United States.
Then, from the point of view by multipolar world, how do we understand the so many conflicts? For example, Ukraine or Middle East or become high tension in East Asia?
Well, let me just say, from an American perspective, there are three areas of the world that matter. East Asia, because of the China threat, Europe, because of the war in Ukraine, and the Middle East, because of Israel's various wars and America's involvement with those wars. And what's going on in the world today is that the United States is not paying that much attention to East Asia because there's no crisis there at the moment. And it's focusing most of its attention on Europe because of the Ukraine war and the Middle East because of Israel's various wars. Now, what's going on here? First of all, with regard to Ukraine, the United States has a deep-seated interest in putting an end to the Ukraine war because the United States does not want to antagonize Russia and push the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. And this is exactly what the Ukraine war has done. It has antagonized the Russians and pushed them into the arms of the Chinese. This is not in our interest. We have a great interest, we the United States have a great interest in ending the war in Ukraine so that we can concentrate on East Asia.
Oh, I see.
But this war against Ukraine, this conflict with Ukraine, this antagonism between the United States and Russia that revolves around Ukraine started during the unipolar moment. This is another example of the foolish consequence, or the consequences of this foolish policy that we pursued during unipolarity. So what's happened here is we've gotten into this war over Ukraine, and we are having an extremely difficult time ending the war so that we can pivot to East Asia. With regard to the Middle East, in the United States, we have this incredibly powerful lobby called the Israel lobby, which pushes the United States to have extremely close relations with Israel and to support Israel unconditionally. So the United States is involved in the Middle East in ways that are not in its strategic interest because of the Israel lobby. So the United States has huge numbers of forces in the Middle East from time to time because of Israel, which is not in our national interest. Those forces should be in East Asia. So what I'm telling you is that in an ideal world, the United States would be concentrating almost all of its attention on East Asia. But we're not doing that. I'm not saying we're not paying any attention to East Asia. We are. But we're not paying enough attention to East Asia because of the Ukraine war, which is a foolish war that's left over from the unipolar moment, and because of our involvement with Israel in the Middle East, which makes no strategic sense and is largely a function of the power of the Israel lobby inside the United States.
Thank you. 5 minutes left, so I want to ask you this question. Perhaps you have read before in Foreign Affairs, this article, America's allies should go nuclear. Have you ever read this article before?
Yes.
How do you think about this?
I don't agree. I think it is in America's interest for its allies not to have nuclear weapons. Let's talk about Japan. Why do I think it's not in our interest for Japan to have nuclear weapons? Well, the fact is that if Japan had nuclear weapons and it got into a war with China over the Senkaku Islands, and the Chinese were winning the war, the Japanese might use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation. And if the Japanese use nuclear weapons against China, because the United States is allied with Japan, the Chinese, in all likelihood, would not simply retaliate against Japan. They would retaliate against the United States as well. So the great fear of the United States is that Japan, acting on its own, with its own nuclear weapons, will drag the United States into a nuclear war. Let me give you another example that illustrates this. During the Cold War, which centered on Central Europe, Central Europe was where the Cold War was focused. Germany was the frontline state in NATO. Germany did not have nuclear weapons. Why did we not want Germany to have nuclear weapons? You might think if Germany had nuclear weapons, it would be much less likely that the Soviet Union would attack into West Germany. I think that's true. And that would have been good for deterrence. So for Germany to have nuclear weapons would have been good for deterrence. Just like for purposes of deterring China today, it would be better if Japan had nuclear weapons. But, and this is the all-important word, but, if Germany had nuclear weapons and the Soviets attacked and the Soviets were winning, Germany would have probably used nuclear weapons to defend itself. And if Germany used nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union probably would have used its nuclear weapons, not just against Germany, but against the United States.
I see.
And the same logic applies to Japan today. If Japan were to get into a nuclear war over the Senkaku Islands with China, the United States would get sucked in. And the United States does not want that to happen. The United States wants to be the only country in an alliance that has nuclear weapons so that it can make sure it does not get incinerated in a crisis or in an actual war. But the point I'm making to you is that for deterrence purposes, it would be better if Japan had nuclear weapons. The Chinese would be more fearful of starting a war over the Senkaku Islands, just like during the Cold War. For deterrence purposes, it would have been better if West Germany had nuclear weapons. But from a narrow American perspective, you, the United States, want to be the country that determines when nuclear weapons are used or not used.
I see. Thank you very much. So finally, could you introduce your two books?
Sure.
Please.
I have written two books that have been recently published in Japan. The first is The Great Delusion. And The Great Delusion is all about what U.S. foreign policy looked like during the unipolar moment, which ran from roughly 1992 to 2017. That was a period where the United States was the only great power in the world and therefore did not have to engage in great power competition because there were no other great powers. So we were, in a very important way, free to pursue a policy of liberal hegemony. During the unipolar moment, the United States pursued a very liberal foreign policy. And it got the United States and other countries as well into all sorts of trouble. It was a remarkably foolish policy. And the story I tell in The Great Delusion is how that liberal foreign policy worked and why it got us into trouble. The other book that I have recently published here in Japan is How States Think. And this is a book that I wrote with Sebastian Rosado, a brilliant colleague of mine who teaches at Notre Dame. And in that book, we deal with this big question of whether states are rational or irrational most of the time. And in the United States and in the West more generally in recent years, all sorts of people have argued that great powers, especially countries like the United States, routinely behave irrationally. They're sort of wild and crazy countries. So what Sebastian and I did was we set out to try to figure out, to determine whether or not states behave rationally or irrationally most of the time. And that's what this book is all about. And the conclusion in our study is that if you look carefully at what rationality is, what you discover looking at the historical record is that most of the time, great powers behaved rationally. This is not to deny that sometimes they behaved irrationally, including the United States. We have some cases in there where the United States behaved irrationally. But most of the time, states behave rationally.
Thank you very much, Professor. This is the end of this program. Thank you very much for coming.
You're more than welcome. Thank you for the interview. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. This is the end of the program. Bye for now.